any Israel-Palestine discussions at all. I am another confused Jewish South African that happens to be extroverted enough to host something like this. I think it's a privilege to be able to talk to you. Welcome back to South Africa and to Cape Town. And I'm going to try my best not to read too much, so please excuse me for the multiple times that I have to look down. Is online okay? Can everybody hear me? Great. So I'll try and look at a combination of the camera and everybody else. So good evening to everyone, and thank you so much for joining us both in person and online for this very exciting and timely event. Tonight's event is titled Missing in Action, the Israeli-Palestinian Peace Process on the Frontline and Online. We are thrilled to be engaging with Gilad Halpern this evening, who I'll be formally introducing to you soon. The last few years have been a tumultuous time for Israeli politics. As recurring elections intensify divisions between different identities, political ideologies, and alliances. An Israeli-Palestinian peace process, once synonymous with the Israeli left, has disappeared from electoral political discourse. Once forming the cornerstone of Israeli political life, the peace process has been systematically hollowed out, now seemingly lacking any practical manifestation, ideology, legitimacy, or vision. A peaceful negotiated settlement between Palestine and Israel has been abandoned in favor of expanding economic and security relations among regional superpowers. As the peace process retreats from the political arena, civil society organizations bear the heavy burden of sustaining momentum, an impossible task without the presence of political will. In the face of an ever-strengthening Israeli right, continued occupation and settlement expansions, the lack of a strategic long-term peace process is one of the single greatest risks to Israelis, Palestinians, and regional security. As conflict inevitably intensifies, a failure to revitalize and prioritize the peace process threatens all that are concerned. Emerging from the most recent preemptive military operation launched by Israel in Gaza, we feel an urgency for peace now more than ever. A ceasefire is not peace. We are very lucky to have critically acclaimed Israeli journalist, broadcaster, and media historian Gilad Halpern here with us this evening. Gilad hosts the Tel Aviv Review podcast and is founding co-editor of the Tel Aviv Review of Books magazine, formerly managing editor at Ynet News and senior editor at Haaretz English edition. Gilad is currently completing a PhD dissertation on the Jewish press in Mandatory Palestine. Welcome, Gilad.
Thank you very much.
Tonight we'll be asking and engaging in some really difficult questions. We ask that everyone please remains respectful and tolerant to allow as many opinions as possible in the same space. As many of you will know, we are expecting load shedding at 8 p.m. unfortunately. For those not in South Africa, this means that our power will go off, a scheduled turn off if you might. We have set up many precautions to ensure the online streaming is not interrupted. If by chance there is an issue with connection, please be patient with us. We will try and fix it immediately. Unfortunately, it is out of our control, but I can assure you that everybody's put as many precautions in place as possible. This evening's event will run as an interview style. We have prepared questions to engage Gilad on all things Israeli-Palestinian peace. Please save any questions that you have for the end, and we'll try to get to everybody's questions. For those online, please keep your microphones muted at all times. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to type them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen and we'll get to them. Without further ado, let's dive in. You feeling
The fact that there's almost suddenly a consensus around one thing, and that is that pursuing a negotiated peace agreement with the Palestinians is no longer on the table, both on the right and much of the left. And this is almost an unprecedented occurrence in Israeli politics, certainly since the left invented itself as the peace camp in the 1980s. So we're talking about almost 30 years during which a negotiated peace, mainly with the Palestinians, but also with the broader Arab world, was the flagship policy of the Israeli left. And now, barring certain pockets in especially the more radical left, it is all but non-existent. And this is actually a major development in Israeli political history, and part of what accounts for the poor showing and the disarray in which the parliamentary left is in at the moment. If you look at the Labour Party, I think is the best example. The country that once led the country and was either a party of government or a party of government in waiting was on the verge of extinction just 2 years ago. It's hard to keep up with so many election campaigns, but I think it was just 2 years ago that it was about to be wiped out and not even garner enough votes to make it to the electoral threshold, which is I forget what's the exact percentage of the votes, but it's somewhere just above 4 seats out of 120. So from this big party of government, it became this marginal niche party, and also even before it went down to this poor showing, it has all but abandoned the peace agenda, leaving it to also very marginal parties on the left. And I hope that answers your question. It was pretty broad, but I think that if we're talking about where the Israeli-Palestinian or the peace camp and the peace agenda is right now in the Israeli political landscape, I think that the answer is nowhere, or almost nowhere.
Thank you. For anybody that does have questions, I know I mentioned earlier to please keep them to the end, but if you're worried about forgetting them, please just make a note on your phone or write them down, and then we'll address them later. So jumping on to question 2, there are, of course, exceptionally complicated and constantly changing power dynamics at play in efforts for and, of course, against the peace process. In the Israeli-Palestinian peace process to date, whose voices do you think are being heard, and whose voices do you think are being silenced? And sort of a second layer of that, who are the key actors, and what particular interests do they have in those roles?
Yeah, well, I think that the only voices that are still heard are those that are sort of singing the same tune, have been singing the same tune for the past 20 years or so. And it's not saying that it's not valid what they're saying. I think there's really much credence to many of the points made by the most vocal spokespersons of the almost defunct peace camp. It's just that it's been so electorally unsuccessful that it's been marginalized and almost wiped out completely out of the political discourse, and therefore anyone even suggesting that Israel, it is within Israel's best interest to pursue to restart negotiations with the Palestinian Authority is almost unheard of. And I mean, if you look at just recently the current defense minister Benny Gantz, when the outgoing government was sworn in and he became a minister, one of the first things that he did was to meet with the president of the Palestinian Authority, with Mahmoud Abbas. And only then people sort of were reminded that that thing can happen, that Mahmoud Abbas exists and is an interlocutor of sorts, and it is something that frontbench ministers in the Israeli cabinet do, because it just hadn't happened for so long. And one of the problems I see, I think, answering the question of that is in the title of tonight's event, where has the peace process gone? I think that it's a victim of what I call the Netanyahu paradigm. It's because Netanyahu, basically he is a very able politician, as we all know, not just his phenomenal ability to get re-elected, but also to pursue his main political project, and that is getting the Palestinian question off the table. And he's done it very well, and we see it in many different aspects and dimensions. The fact that the opposition to Netanyahu has ceased to talk about the peace process is one marker of his success in that respect. There are others that we'll probably get to in a second. And the Netanyahu paradigm, as I see it, managed to undermine several axioms of the peace camp. Two in particular, I would say. One is that it is in the best interest of Israel to pursue a peace negotiation with the Palestinians, that it is something that Israel needs to do to secure certainly its long-term existence, but also its short-term security and not just security, but also normal function. And the other thing is that this axiom that he managed to refute was that in the absence of a peace process, Israel will suffer consequences, whether diplomatic or economic. And that derives from the peace process of the 1990s, in which Israel prospered in an unprecedented manner from its mere engagement in negotiations with the Palestinians and the broader Arab world, but also diplomatically. Doors started opening left, right, and center. And along came Netanyahu 20 years later and said, okay, Israel is doing phenomenally well economically. It's the startup nation, right? Tel Aviv has now become the most expensive city in the world. People are flocking to Israel, both business people and tourists. And it's also doing pretty well diplomatically. There haven't been any sanctions to be reckoned with, and that convinced Israelis that maybe the peace process is not so urgent to be pursued, and that seeped down to the broader Israeli electorate and also to the broader, the wider political spectrum. Hence, the complete disappearance of the issue from the agenda.
So you mentioned the word peace quite a lot, and I think when it comes to any sort of political discourse, particularly with Israel and Palestine, the word peace gets thrown around quite a lot. And my next question is about that exact concept of peace. So the word peace can either mean an absence of war or a reconciliation, following post-conflict after some sort of tension. So what would you define peace as in an Israeli-Palestinian context in today's world? Is it a positive peace? Is positive peace a possibility? And is there any intention, do you think, among Israeli and Palestinian leaders to actually negotiate a peace settlement?
Yeah. Well, the main thing here, as I think your question sort of suggests, is not really the possibility or the contingency of peace, but rather the willingness for peace. I mean, to what extent there's really good faith, I think, is really the answer. It's really the key issue here. I don't think that there's currently, certainly on the Israeli side, but also to an extent on the Palestinian side, but here I place much more of the blame on the Israeli side. In moving forward, there's no willingness for moving forward in good faith. What again? It comes down to Netanyahu, who also invested himself greatly in doing his utmost to dodge the bullet of negotiation and drag his feet as much as he can. It's worked for him phenomenally well, also for his own political needs, but also for, as I said, for Israel more broadly. And I think that, of course, peace for me is negotiated end to mutual claims by Palestinians mainly. I mean, they have most of the claims, and also Israelis. And I think that this is where, if you look at the so-called disengagement from Gaza, the pullout in 2005, that was seen by certainly people on the left, on the right, but also many people on the left, as some sort of an overture, as a gesture.
Sorry, Dan, can I ask you to close that behind me?
Back on it today, and actually some people were able to even foresee that in real time. I admittedly wasn't one of them. It actually drove us farther away from peace, because what it did, it perpetuated the de facto split between the two Palestinian governments, the PA government in the West Bank and the Hamas government in Gaza, who are unable and unwilling to work together. There have been several attempts to reach a power sharing agreement. I think they've given up on it because these attempts are pretty old now. And this, by the way, is a godsend for Netanyahu and the right, because it only it provides a perfect excuse why there's no prospect for moving forward right now, because whatever you negotiate with only half of the Palestinian people would not be accepted by the other half. So it is the perfect excuse to perpetuate the status quo. So there's also like I would say an epistemological shift for many of the Israelis, because the main paradigm of the peace camp was the so-called land for peace paradigm, and Israelis were led to believe that pulling away from territories would necessarily give them peace in return, which is why many of them supported the pullout in real time. I supported the pullout in real time because I didn't think it would give us peace, but because there were so many other issues to address. But I thought it would create a snowball effect that would basically create a precedent of pulling out of territories that would become bigger, basically spiral out of Israel's control, that would become bigger than the process itself. I was of course mistaken, because basically what it did was actually dissuade so many Israelis away from the concept of land for peace, even though in this particular case it was implemented so badly. And some would say even with a malicious intention, even though I don't know if Sharon was that smart, yeah, that forward-looking and so strategically oriented. But in effect, that's what happened. So basically, I think that go back to your question, what a positive content for peace, I think, is coming in good faith to negotiation with the Palestinians and meaning to address the claims, the just claims, with good intentions.
I guess each question also has like 3 mini questions attached,
Yeah.
so you're answering relatively well.
And 7 mini answers. Yeah.
I know load shedding starting at 8. Okay, so a 10-minute warning for us.
Okay.
We're still going to continue during load shedding just so that we don't sort of get thrown off. So my next question is, Israel-Palestine exists, within this broader, turbulent, perpetually chaotic political economy of the Middle East. And since 2020, many have positioned the Abraham Accords as a process towards peace, rather than as an economic deal wrapped inside an arms deal between regional superpowers. So in your opinion, through the normalization of relations with Israel, have the Abraham Accords distracted key regional players from that peace and Palestinian sovereignty? And a mini question of that question, what are the key regional dynamics that are shaping Israeli-Palestinian engagement and potentials for peace?
Yeah. Well, the Abraham Accords, I think, are a really case in point. I wrote on Facebook upon their signing, all we are saying is give arms deals a chance. It's one of my favorite quips. Because I think this is exactly what it was. It was a cynical, transactional, diplomatic maneuver that had really one intention, and that is to marginalize and corner the Palestinians. It was really done specifically above the heads. It was, of course, a great feat for Netanyahu with the help of the Donald Trump White House. That was probably the first White House that was outwardly anti-Palestinian. I mean, all administrations were always immensely pro-Israel, both Democratic and Republican, but it was the first one that didn't even have the Palestinians' best interests remotely in mind. And this is a confluence of interests that led to that. And again, this is another thing that entrenched the Netanyahu paradigm, in the sense that undermining one of the premises of the Israeli peace camp, which is that sorting out the Palestinian issue would also create a knock-on effect on the broader Arab world, and by solving the Palestinian issue, Israel would open up to more than 20 other Arab countries. Now, that was probably only partially true, because the Arab world was only nominally united around the Palestinian issue. It was a rallying cry for their own domestic purposes, for one, and it was also it was never followed up by any concrete steps, because many of these Arab regimes are self-serving and corrupt. So not only when it comes to human rights or whatever, it's also when it comes to the Palestinian issue. And this is why when they were offered this very lucrative deal by Israel and the US of arms deals, and we don't yet know exactly the extent of what happened behind the scenes, in the sense of what sort of cyber warfare Israel sold them, etc. But it basically led them to do in practice what they have been doing on paper for so long, and that is sell the Palestinians down the river. And for Netanyahu, it worked very well, because it was, for him, a proof that in order to open up to the broader Arab world, you don't have to pass through Ramallah. And even the very little remaining incentive that Israelis had to pursue a negotiated peace with the Palestinians, so that, I don't know, they could do business in Iraq and go on holiday in Damascus or whatever. There were, for those of you who are old enough to remember, there were newspaper articles in the 90s in Israel foreseeing that. So basically Netanyahu says, you just wait, and just like the Emirates and Morocco and Bahrain are now joining hands with us, so will the rest of the Arab world, regardless of the Palestinian issue. So coming back to our issue tonight, the Palestinian peace process, this is yet another setback out of many. And come to think of it, the Arab unity behind the Palestinians, as much as it was fake and disingenuous at times, was their last remaining political and diplomatic asset. And even now, it's gone.
So we're talking about, from the Abraham Accords and now following the Oslo Accords, the two-state solution has been a guiding principle in efforts towards peace. However, it seems as though debates in Israel-Palestine, continue expanding, realistic options for peace are shrinking. Does the possibility of a two-state solution still exist in today's world? And if so, what does it look like in 2022? What do you think has changed since the two-state solution was first proposed to now?
Well, it's become really all the rage now to say that it's too late for the two-state solution, that we're past the point of no return, that settlement expansion has made it all but impossible. And it's really become all the rage in my circles on the more radical left. First of all, I'm not so sure. There is a very good case to be made, and actually, if you're interested in someone who makes that case very well, there's a former general and a researcher called Shaul Arieli, who writes non-stop about, he knows the West Bank like the back of his own hand, and he's been analyzing settlement expansion really very minutely. And basically his claim is that most settlements, the settlement blocks where 70 to 80% of settlers live, are adjacent to the Green Line and occupy a very small percentage of the territory of the West Bank, and under some sort of land swap arrangement, most of the settlers would be able to be annexed to Israel at a very little cost. It would require the evacuation of several tens of thousands of other settlers, who are clearly the more ideological ones, so therefore it will be harder to evacuate them. But I still don't think it's impossible. Given the alternative, which is actually a South African model of a one-state solution, where a rainbow nation of Jews and Arabs and others has its own potential problems, as you know better than anyone else, which is also a potential solution, but you just on the weighing the pros and cons of either solution, I'm even though I'm more inclined to say that a one-state solution might address the core issues more deeply, I don't know whether in the long term or for the interest of both sides it is a preferable solution. But I think at the end of the day, it all comes to one thing that I mentioned before, and that is goodwill.
Yeah.
I think that if Israel wants to end the occupation, it will find a way to do it.
Yeah.
Either a two-state solution, either one-state solution. I mean, the fact that people are suggesting a one-state solution because there hasn't been enough political will to carry out the two-state solution is absurd to me, because there's even less political will to carry out a one-state solution. So is that your proposed solution? I think it's ridiculous. And personally, I support whatever would lead to the end of the occupation more quickly and more thoroughly. You know, and of course it comes back to, it has to have garner some sort of popular support on both sides. And, you know, it remains to be, I think that currently there's more support
early. So they'll say 2.5 hours and then it might end in an hour. But there's also, like in Joburg, it can be 4 to 6 hours at a time.
Oh, wow.
We are on with the online people.
Yes, if everybody on Zoom could pop an emoji of sorts or a word into the chat just so we know that you are present. We think we may have rebooted. We've obviously just had load shedding hit. So if you can hear me and see us, are we getting some thumbs up?
Amazing.
Yay, we worked through it.
Okay. So should I just finish off the last point?
Do you remember
that I
where
had?
you were?
Yeah, I was. I do. Yeah?
Yeah.
Are we good?
Go.
Yes.
So we're gonna
Yeah, okay.
keep on.
So I think that actually I don't remember where I was. It was about the I think it was about garnering popular support for
Yes.
either solution, and I think
Yeah.
right now as it stands, the two-state solution is certainly more popular in Israel, but also among Palestinians. It is far more popular than a one-state solution. So I think that it's all down to visionary leadership and political will on both sides.
So ignore my phone torch, please. We're doing what we can. So the Land for Peace negotiation principle, which formed the cornerstone of a potential negotiated settlement under, the two-state solution, believed that land swaps between Israelis and Palestinian leadership would pave the way to peace. Now, since then, Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands has strengthened, in particular through settlement expansion. Is the strategy of land for peace still appropriate? Is it still possible?
Yeah.
What's the role of land in peace negotiations? And do you think there's any other factors that need to be
Yeah.
considered?
So I think that I sort of almost answered the question entirely earlier when I
Yeah.
spoke about the disengagement, and I think that I have very little to add. I think that what the disengagement proved to us is that land for peace on its own is not enough.
Yeah.
That it has to be part of a broader effort towards addressing other issues and claims of the Palestinians, and that land for peace is really not enough, because there's other issues that need to be addressed. I think that when it comes to settlement expansion, of course, it's all meant to frustrate any sort of territorial arrangement. But if you look at the settlement enterprise in general, despite the fact that it's been going on for so long, despite the fact that it's been the darling of every single Israeli government, barring very few ones for very brief periods. I mean, the amount of money that was poured into the settlement enterprises, it's probably the most expensive enterprise in Israel's history. Despite that, and despite the fact that Israel is densely populated and a small country with fewer and fewer open spaces, hardly anyone moves to the settles in the West Bank. The settlements are still, in terms of numbers, are still a minority. The problem is that they have a lot of political power, and when the powers shift and the tables turn, if that ever happens, against the settlements, then I don't think it will be hard at all to see them evacuated.
So the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem are extremely contentious areas, which carry a lot of emotion, and often the sites of, they're often these places of horrific violence that receives international coverage. How do the varying internal governance structures and the external sources of Israeli control over the three territories influence the Israeli-Palestinian peace process? How would a future peace process engage with these particular three territories?
What I think Israel has done so well and has, thanks to what it has managed to carry on with the occupation for so long, is something that actually, you know, barring the other differences, but the apartheid government was unable to do. And that is to play around with the legal structure and basically create all sorts of, I would say, tricks, really, to avoid the fact that right now Jews are a minority between the river and the sea. No, still a small minority. I want to say a large minority. The numbers aren't that far off 50-50. But still, the fact that a minority of Jews rules over a majority of non-Jews is very rarely flagged. And that is because Israel has determined a different legal status for each of these territories. So Gaza is, for Israel, of course, not for international law, is an autonomous region. The West Bank is under occupation. East Jerusalem is under semi-occupation because East Jerusalem Palestinians are, well, first of all, East Jerusalem has been annexed to Israel. Israeli law has been enacted on East Jerusalem, unlike the West Bank. But East Jerusalem Palestinians are not citizens of Israel. They are permanent residents. So that's a different legal status. And of course, there are the Israeli Arabs, the Palestinian community within Israel that makes up about 20%, more than 20% of its population, who are full citizens, but also under certain conditions. And the fact that that Israel manages, again, and in a very astute and flexible manner, this very intricate system of control is something that can perpetuate the occupation. And you've probably heard recently that leading human rights groups have decided to, you know, take a step forward and say that Israel enacts a system of apartheid on the Palestinians, is exactly meant to counter that sort of legal acrobatics. To say that despite the fact that, you know, there's different sort of, you know, some are more equal than others, if you like, still at the end of the day, it is meant to do one thing, and that is create a situation whereby a Jewish minority could rule over a non-Jewish majority with very few consequences.
So the next question that I have is a very long one, but merely because it's giving some context before actually asking the question itself. So in recent years, there's been a gradual move among commentators away from a proposed two-state solution, as we were chatting about earlier, as many now see as a distant and an unattainable dream. As the two-state solution dwindles, alternative strategies for peace are being proposed. Of note is the Holy Land Confederation proposal by Dr. Hiba Husseini, Dr. Yossi Beilin, and versions of a one-state solution as posed by Peter Baindart and others, where a one-state solution sees the creation of one unified state, where all citizens, Jewish and Palestinian, share equal rights. The Holy Land Confederation sees a Palestinian state existing alongside an Israeli state with deep cooperation between the two governments, with Jerusalem as an open city. So could you explain more about the different solutions that are being proposed? And what do you think the strengths and weaknesses are of each of those solutions? And who is supporting which solution?
So we spoke about the two-state solution and the one-state solution. We haven't really spoken about the confederation. It is sort of like a mixture of both. It is recognizing on the one hand that a premise that I don't necessarily subscribe to, that a two-state solution per se, that is a complete separation to two political entities, is unattainable at the moment, and therefore looking for ways to salvage whatever can be salvaged of the two-state solution, and mitigate the adverse effects of the hindrances towards that solution. Basically, it means, you know, as far as I understand it, it's a pretty straightforward confederation. That is, that on whatever can the two countries could have their own autonomy. They will have their own autonomy on issues that are more regional, such as defense and maybe macroeconomics, because after all, the economies of the Israelis and Palestinians are pretty much entangled. There's more from the Palestinian side. Of course, Israel can being a much more economically robust country, could thrive without the relatively backward Palestinian economy. But of course, the Palestinians cannot exist other than on the back of the Israelis. So to cater to the needs of Palestinian economic development, there has to be some sort of a joint management of that. But you know, people have been suggesting that as an alternative to this two-state solution. And going back to what I said earlier about, you know, people, they say, okay, the two-state solution is impossible to achieve, therefore we'll opt for the second best, which is the confederation. And again, I don't think that's that holds water. It all boils down to political goodwill, and in the absence of which we will not have a two-state solution, we will not have confederation, we will not have a one-state solution. So it's all basically, I met with someone this afternoon who said that, you know, dealing with all that is like discussing the whys and the wherefores of world peace, right? It's so out of reach at the moment that we're basically, it's almost like a Talmudic sort of discussion, right? You know, whether we want that or that, it's entirely hypothetical.
I keep thinking about the word politics and goodwill in the same sentence.
Yeah.
So there's expansive evidence showing that Israel's continued occupation of the Palestinian territories is one of the single greatest risks to Israeli society. What is your take on this? And to what extent does Israel's continued occupation impact Israeli security? And on top of that, what do you think the consequences are for a potential peace process?
Yeah. So again, it depends who you ask and how you define threats to security.
I suppose you can't represent the whole of Israel.
Yeah, no, but if you ask the Israeli man on the street, they would say that the least secure period was the height of the peace process. That, you know, whenever Israel made concessions to the Palestinians, they reacted with suicide bombers and violence. And it is true to an extent. Also, you know, if you look at it historically, it is true. The height of the Palestinian terror campaigns was during the Oslo years of the 1990s and the early 2000s, right after the failure of the Camp David summit. The problem is that if you look at it more closely and analyze who were the perpetrators of these terror campaigns, you would see that it was just the very same organizations that were bent on derailing the peace process, and did that just for that, hoping that the Israelis would react in the way that they eventually did, saying, okay, we will not make any more concessions to the Palestinians because what we get in return is violence and terror. Sorry, I forgot what your question. What was it? What was it about?
So you were talking about your take on
On the security. Yes. So there's another thing that I want to say about this, and that is that another slogan of the peace camp for many years was "Hakibush mashchit," the occupation corrupts. And what they meant for a long time was that soldiers who serve in the West Bank and I don't know, serve at checkpoints and raid Palestinian houses would adopt this kind of violence in their life back home. They said, a soldier who can beat a civilian would beat his wife. Sort of like that was the a warning. Yeah. And right now what we're saying is that the occupation does corrupt, but in a different way. What we see now with the erosion of the rule of law at home is that the non-democratic system of ruling in the West Bank is slowly seeping into Israel proper. And what we're saying is that you cannot have the same country enacting more or less than more exemplary liberal democracy at home and an entirely non-democratic military rule with its other arm. And what we're seeing now, actually thanks to a confluence of several political currents, so you have the hardline illiberal right that has been trying continuously to undermine the liberal traits of the Israeli system of government, combined with Netanyahu and his followers who jumped on this bandwagon for his own personal interests, trying to get away from his legal woes. Yeah. So basically, in order to do that, he is undermining the state prosecution and the role of the Attorney General and all these people who are meant to fight corruption at home just as much as uphold a functioning rule of law. And this is a pretty powerful political current currently in Israel. I think trying to import the system of government from the West Bank into Israel proper, also weakening in completely any sort of judicial review, and also openly advocating for a system of Jewish supremacy within Israel. So this very basic constitutional principle of equality before the law, undermining that just the same. This is really I think the main danger of the occupation, that as long as it lasts, that those symptoms would only amplify.
Yeah. Excuse my phone torch. My eyes are just straining a bit too much.
Are we going to be able to ask questions at some point?
Yes.
Yes, at the end.
Coming up.
Do you want to ask questions in the middle somewhere, or should we wait till the end?
I think ask the next question, then we take.
Perfect. So one of the incredible phenomena of the South African story of the ending of apartheid and this transition to democracy was the societal switch from, a white ultranationalism to an acceptance of multiculturalism. South Africa became a country for everybody that lives in it. Although this is not 100% true, it's what's said on paper, but in reality it's often something different. And it's not 100% perfect by any stretch of the imagination. There was a fundamental change in a very short space of time, and it allowed a relatively peaceful transition. Do you see this as a possibility within Israel-Palestine? And if so, what conditions would move such a transition in societal change? Must the motivation come from leadership or from within society, reflecting an attitudinal shift to the status quo? And last sort of aspect is, are there any sustainable currents at work in Israeli or Palestinian society today that you think could trend towards a desire to end the cycle of constant conflict?
So I'll start with the last bit of your answer. And actually, one of the positive side effects of the absence of the peace agenda is that same energy has been redirected inward. And by that I mean that while the peace agenda was still on the table, all Israeli liberals and peace-supporting people were very much orientated towards reconciliation with the Palestinians, at the expense, with the Palestinians in the West Bank and the future Palestinian state, at the expense of the Palestinians at home, so the Palestinian community within Israel. And what we've seen now, since any kind of prospect for negotiation with the Palestinians in the West Bank and the future Palestinian state have been completely wiped out. That energy has been transformed into similar discussions, similar efforts vis-a-vis Palestinians at home. And you do see a lot of grassroots activity in Israel, meaning to end the segregation between the two communities that have been almost all but segregated, barring certain bubbles of coexistence.
Pockets of peace.
If you will. You see, well, first of all, I think that the main aspect of that, the main expression of that is the fact that for the first time ever, an Arab party member of the ruling coalition in Israel, something that also thanks to an impossible confluence of political interests made it possible, but still it's something that was completely unheard of until pretty recently. And also you see many more Arab speakers on TV. I mean, for example, this might seem rather innocuous to you, but the fact that on Channel 12 News, it's now called, the flagship panel discussion on Friday night now has a permanent Arab commentator. That's something that was never done before. Arab commentators were brought on only to comment on Arab affairs, and not always. Some people, quite often, Jewish commentators were brought on to, so-called Arabists were brought on to commentate on Arab affairs. You see, I don't know, I live not far from the Tel Aviv University campus. You hear on the street a lot more Arabic spoken than before. You see veiled Muslim women on campus, something that was very rare and almost completely non-existent until, within my living memory. I mean, 20 years ago, it was almost unheard of. So you see a lot more, a lot less segregation between Jews and Arabs in Israel. And I think that answers the question. I forget what it was.
I think so. So I've got about 4 questions left, but I know we've got some questions in the crowd in the darkness somewhere there. Do you want to go ahead and can you attempt raising your hand? Is it just, can't really see?
We're going to go with the Samsung question.
No, I was going to ask a different question, but I just thought that if other people would ask, I don't have to.
No, you can go for it.
So thank you very much. Just at the beginning of the discussion, there was the point raised about which voices are allowed and which are silenced. I don't think that was really related to. I mean, we live here in a country where there was apartheid, where there were sanctions and pressure on the government to, and a lot of people say that is what kind of turned it and changed the dispensation. You spoke just very easily, one-state solution. So the question is, to what extent I'm more interested in the voices silenced kind of point. What are the implications for people speaking about issues that they aren't allowed to speak about? So, for example, the point about a Jewish homeland that isn't necessarily a nation state. All of these kind of things. How are these voices silenced? What are the implications? And perhaps just the point that there are kind of parallel kind of things happening in Jewish communities in the diaspora that almost shadow or model, how Israel approaches it.
I just want to repeat the question for Zoom, so just so I've got some clarity. You're specifically asking on which voices are silenced within Israeli-Palestinian society?
On what issues, and specifically how are they silenced?
Okay.
What are the implications for people that say what they aren't supposed to say? And perhaps just one additional point, the conflation with anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
So
That's a
hopefully,
whole new discussion. Yeah, I'll say several things. First of all, there isn't really a formal mechanism to silence dissent. I think that in most cases, people are free to say whatever they will. I think that on that, the Israeli liberal democracy is still pretty strong. There are several exceptions when there are, during wars on Gaza, that there's a lot of, I would say, hate speech or presumed hate speech on social media. And of course, that is unevenly enforced. So I don't think there have been any charges pressed against Jews for hate speech on social media, and there have been several against Arabs. There's also not just on the criminal level, so not just prosecuted by the state. Quite often, it's happened that people have been fired from the jobs because of making such statements on social media, and of course that is unlawful dismissal. So it's gone to the courts, and quite often it is Arabs who are dismissed from the jobs rather than Jews who are. I think that the main mechanism of silence is the one that I mentioned before, and that is the great success of the Netanyahu paradigm. That it's convinced more and more Israelis that talking about any kind of reconciliation with the Palestinians is a waste of time. And of course, for people in the political arena, it is a waste of effort because it's not politically serving them in any way. I'm sorry. And there have been several forums of discussion and imagining a new sort of, potential futures for Israel, but I feel that also they have sort of died out. If you remember, about 15 years ago, there was this sudden explosion of political projects for the Palestinian community in Israel. They were called the vision statements of the Arabs in Israel, and 3 different Palestinian think tanks came up with a suggested constitution for a binational Israel. That was 2006. 2007, 2008. I don't think anything similar has been suggested since. I think that this, again, Netanyahu's success in taking the issue off the table has completely depleted the energy of people to move forward and to think that, you know, there's any sort of any sense of hope. So you see less and less of that, but it still exists. And I think you've asked about the diaspora. I think that going back to what I call the Netanyahu paradigm, the main victims of the Netanyahu, the main benefactors of the Netanyahu paradigm are, of course, the Israelis, who don't have to give up the West Bank and can enjoy diplomatic relations with the broader Arab world and have a booming economy. However, the main victims of the Netanyahu paradigm are diaspora Jews who are engaged with Israel and want Israel's best, and in fact bear the brunt of the side effects of the Netanyahu paradigm in the hostility, in the resentment that it creates among civil society, especially in Europe, and the governments, especially in your country. You just see how hostile the government is to Israel at the moment, and I'm sure that for any Jewish person with some care for Israel, you know, not just, you know, the hardline Zionists, but anyone who wishes the best for Israel, it is very hard to see that. And you see a similar thing, I mean, especially in America, with the fragmentation of the Jewish community there over Israel, that you see more and more voices, not just anti-Zionist voices. I mean, you mentioned Peter Beinart before. I mean, Peter Beinart is a case in point as someone who was really a leading liberal Zionist who has transitioned entirely into anti-Zionism. And also, but other than the growing sects of anti-Zionism within the Jewish community, there's also an even bigger, invisible sector within that community that doesn't care about Israel at all. I mean, Peter Beinart, his Israel is also a way of showing love for cares about it. And the number of American Jews don't care enough about Israel to even care. And I don't know. I don't. You know, Israelis are hysterical about this. And some people who are engaged in Israel diaspora relations see that as the potential end of the world. I certainly don't think that. I think actually overall it's healthy. I think that, you know, diaspora Jews should have a critical distance from Israel, and even if that distance is a very big distance, that is good. But it is, of course, making life a lot harder for diaspora Jews, and I don't know how well it will serve Israel at the end of the day when the squad will take over the Democratic Party in the US and will start calling the shots. I don't know what will happen. So this is, I think, the main adverse effect of the Netanyahu paradigm that is not addressed enough. I hope that answers the question.
I see another hand vaguely in the darkness.
I'm glad you brought up Zionism more specifically, because that's what my question relates to. And you did go somewhere in answering it, but I'm going to simplify it a bit more to get a more direct answer. And Zionism throughout the years has taken on different meanings, and especially recently and I think especially in diaspora more than in Israel itself, has shifted in its meaning and its politics of identifying as one or not as one, or anti-one. What do Israelis think
Yeah.
Zionism is?
I just want to repeat for Zoom.
Oh, yeah.
So for all of our Zoom counterparts, we just got a question from the crowd, basically talking about how the term Zionism has shifted over the years, and the question is, correct me if I'm wrong, but specifically what Israeli society understands the term Zionism to mean.
Yeah, well, I will say one thing that is somewhat provocative, but I think that still, in essence, is true. And that is that Zionism means more to non-Israelis than it does to Israelis. I think that for many Israelis, Zionism is really part of the furniture. That Israelis generally, when they say Zionism, they mean patriotism. So, caring for the greater good. Yeah, you would hear Israelis saying that, volunteering to help the poor is a Zionist thing to do, even though it has nothing to do with, Jewish state in the land of Israel. More pertinently, I think that, and it goes back to what we said earlier about the Confederation. I think the reason that a confederation would be a hard sell for Israelis is because, a very principal pillar of the Zionism is self-reliance, and a confederation would entail, to a certain extent, relying on the mercy of the Palestinians, and that is something that I think an overwhelming proportion of Israelis would either reject entirely or find very, very hard to swallow. And self-reliance is something that is what Israel is all about, right? We are no longer the diaspora Jews that rely on the kindness of strangers, but we do what it is that we want to do. And I think that therefore, this is. I think that at the end of the day, this is what for Israelis Zionism boils down to. I think that for diaspora Jews it means a lot more. It's an identity thing. It's really asserting themselves as, what they are. And this also, Raymond, maybe goes back to answering your question a bit of any sort of models of Zionism that's not in a nation state context. I think that it is very interesting ideas, but they have really no traction and have not been translated into any sort of political program that has any sort of traction. I think it's a wonderful idea, and at the end of the day, Israelis would subscribe to it because what are you going to do? There is already a thriving Jewish community in Israel that cannot be done away, other than great injustice. But the problem is that they have to be forced into it, and there's still time until that happens. And if they come to the census, they might be able to fend it off. But before, it will only. I think it will only happen if there's really no other alternative.
Before potentially getting another question from those that are in person, is there any questions on Zoom? Is there anybody online?
There is one that's being typed up.
Okay.
So I imagine it's the...
Give it a few. Okay, so maybe while it's being typed, I can ask, is there another question in the crowd?
Yes, Sally.
Okay, yes, I can see a hand.
Yeah, so self-reliance, went out the window a long time ago in Israel because there's a lot of reliance on Palestinian workers coming in from Gaza and other places. Just in terms of confederation, just a quick comment. I mean, Paris said a very long time ago that if there were two states and they'd worked out a way that's a really different understanding from the way you've used confederation this evening. But I'd like to, and I agree with most of what you've said, but I'd like to ask a question at a different kind of level. So the Netanyahu paradigm, unfortunately, in my view, has been extremely successful in the ways that you've outlined. How come the left let that happen? Or the center left? Because even in South Africa, and apartheid South Africa, and even if you think that we wouldn't have had an attempt at least transition to democracy, and yes, we do have a constitution here, even if you think that sanctions really made that happen, but before it happened, there were relationships across these policed segregated lines and across apartheid legislation, where people really tried very hard in multiple ways to keep a dream alive. Now, I don't think that the Israeli dream is a united, unified state. I think divorce has always been what both sides want, and therefore I'm in favor of a two-state solution. But how did the left let that happen? So he was smart, Netanyahu, but they're smart. Everybody I know in Israel is smart. And a lot of those smart people think along the lines that I've heard here in this room, and I know some of the people who share. And what happened? Where was the activism? I think Israel's too prosperous for its own good, and that's a terrible thing to say out loud.
Do you want to repeat that? Yeah, sure. I have a lot to say.
I'm trying to find a way to summarize it.
So, but if I may, Sally is asking how, you know, the Netanyahu paradigm, as I've outlined it, has been very successful.
Yeah.
But how come there hasn't been any pushback from the left to that? Or
Great summary.
not enough pushback, I would say. That is a wonderful question that I'm not sure I have the answer to. It is. I think that, you know, you mentioned what it was like in South Africa, and I think that the problem in South Africa is that they said the quiet part loud. And in Israel, they've been very careful not to do that. Because if you look, I mean, some have been doing it willingly for that purpose, some have not. I think that the Supreme Court has been, I don't know if wittingly or not, very careful not to overstretch the boundaries of liberal democracy. And to the extent that looking at Israel from the outside, you can say with a certain degree of justice that it is a functioning liberal democracy. And when there are human rights violations, they are limited and temporary and subject to judicial review. And also another thing that is absolutely crucial, I think, here, is the fact that Israel created the notion, false or not, that the occupation is temporary, and has been working on it relentlessly. And this is why, for example, if you go back 45 years, Menachem Begin, who was the primary advocate of Greater Israel, refrained from annexing the West Bank exactly for that, because he knew that what allowed the occupation is the perception that it's temporary. And that worked not only on human rights forums and in international law forums abroad, it's also worked on Israelis at home, specifically left-leaning Israelis who were abhorred by the occupation, but said, okay, it's a necessary evil for now. And I think that the Netanyahu paradigm is, even though Netanyahu himself refrained from annexing the West Bank, the Netanyahu paradigm is eating away at that, because fewer and fewer people are convinced that the occupation is temporary. I mean, it's been 55 years.
5 years.
It's more than 3 times of, almost 3 times the number of years Israel existed without the occupation. So you can say that right now is, the occupation is an integral part of Israel and maybe even of Zionism. And I think that part of the pushback that you get among anti-Zionists, both in the Jewish community abroad and in hitherto sympathetic quarters within Western liberalism, is down to that. I mean, the fact that people are no longer willing to tolerate the occupation because it is not temporary. And I think that's also part of the reason that the left is in disarray is that it's separated along this line. Some people like myself, for example, have gone overboard and left the so-called moderate left in favor of a more radical left, speaking out more forcefully against the occupation, against the Netanyahu paradigm, and some who are still within that the confines of thinking that the occupation is temporary. And yeah, I mean, this is part of that. This is part of the explanation that accounts for the reason why the left is so weak, because it is really split along this very fundamental point of whether the occupation is bad, not just because it does disservice to Israel, but whether it's bad because it is inherently bad for its human rights violations, etc. And I think that they've been unwilling to, unable to bridge this gap and coalesce into a more coherent political force. Hope that answers the question.
Can I follow up with something
Sure.
small? Well,
Yeah.
I don't think it's small, but other than Gilad Levy,
Mm-hmm.
who some people don't read Haaretz because of Gilad Levy, even though they agree with everything else in Haaretz. I'm just curious as to whether organizations like Breaking the Silence or a whole slew of other organizations where Palestinians, both Arabs within Israel and people from the West Bank, work with Israeli Jews. How widely known is that? Does anybody care? Is it on the front page that there is, to quote, there is another way?
Yeah. And again, also on this, sorry, I'll repeat Sally's question.
Can I answer the question?
Please.
Keeping the
Because-
theme of many questions.
No, it's the question related, that's Lauren, in fact, you related to right at the beginning, the role of civil society.
Yeah.
And the question as to what kind of influence or impact, because there is a proliferation, as Sally mentioned some of them, there's a very broad-based proliferation of, people that are focused on shared society, are trying to build relationships between Arabs and Palestinians, both inside the Green Line and across the Green Line, etc. What kind of impact?
Yeah. Okay. So the two questions were about, what kind, how will that gain this alternative view will gain any tractions within Israeli society, and what organizations and people and spokespersons are bent on that. I think that the left is split on that as well. And if you take the recent transformation of B'Tselem, for example, that I'll say more on in a bit, and Breaking the Silence, you will see how these two civil society organizations that are both dedicated to ending the occupation have been working in completely different ways. Breaking the Silence, as you probably know, is an organization that was formed around 15 years ago, that is meant to bring testimonies of soldiers who served in the West Bank and Gaza, and bring them to the knowledge of the wider Israeli public by way of publishing all sorts of publications, exhibitions, and other discursive strategies. What the the credo, I would say, of breaking the silence is that they have to appeal and create a critical mass within Israeli society. Basically, they're thinking like people thought in the early days of the internet, right? That, if you bring knowledge to people, there'll be fewer idiots. And I think we all know what happened to that. And I think that the breaking the silence have encountered a similar problem, that they have put out all these testimonies out, but very few people have listened to them. So they have been adamant at appealing to the mainstream Israeli public, and they had every reason to believe that it would happen, not only because the Israeli, just like Sally knows only clever Israelis. I think that this is this is a pretty accepted view of Israelis, that they are right-thinking people, and they thought that by putting a mirror opposite them and telling them the truth, they would make the right decision. And also, these soldiers of breaking the silence had immense cultural capital that brought them. They weren't just, outsiders preaching to the masses. There were the very own elite of Israel. There were officers, some of them in combat units, that were basically until they spoke out, were heroes of Israeli society. And it didn't work. And they weren't able to translate this cultural capital into a political impact. Now, what B'Tselem have done, and it's also interesting to look at them from a longitudinal perspective, B'Tselem is the oldest human rights organization in Israel. It was founded in the late 80s, exactly to bring to the fore human rights violations that the occupation does in the West Bank and Gaza. And they've been doing that relentlessly for many years. And they've also they were very mindful of not distancing themselves from the Israeli mainstream. For example, they've always worked in tandem with the Israeli army's legal department, right? Whenever there was evidence of human rights violation, they sent it off to the military prosecution to say, okay, now you investigate and you press charges if necessary. And at some point they stopped doing that because they understood it was completely futile. So what B'Tselem did under the leadership of its current chairman, Gilad, they've essentially given up on Israeli public opinion. They say if anything is gonna change, it's not gonna be some sort of an organic movement from within the Israeli public. It's got to be imposed from outside, and this is where they've become a lot more active, a lot more radical, also in their activism, and a lot more outspoken. And some would say anti-Israel with a certain degree of truth. It has become dedicated to restricting the freedom of action of Israeli governments. And I think that the depleted Israeli left is also split on that, on what strategy is the right thing to do. Whether we would still bank on the right-thinking Israeli just like Churchill said that about the Americans, right? That they would do the right thing after having exhausted all the alternatives, right? So the same with this, whether the Israelis will do the right thing after having exhausted all the alternatives, and or to have, like B'Tselem, to give up entirely on the Israeli public opinion and do more lobbying abroad.
I believe we have one question on Zoom.
It's less of a question and just I want to share Mark Turok is basically, it's more of a call for action, which I think is a great place to end off, where he's saying that there's been little interest for so long, now we're seeing interest and it's time to be pragmatic and creative and open the space to conceptually build a possibility for peace.
That is a great note to end off on. I want to add just to everybody, so I recently came back from an Israel-Palestine trip, and I went there, it was for a specific program, and it was very different to any other Israel program opportunities I've come across. It was very focused on, let's talk about words like occupation, let's talk about Israel-Palestine politics, and I went there saying, you know, like, I'm going to get all the answers to all my questions, which is not at all how it went. I left with many more questions than I arrived with. And so if anybody's leaving this event feeling like they have more questions or feeling like they're more confused, I urge you to look at it from an angle of you learnt more. If you're more confused and you have more questions, it means that you've absorbed more information, and I think that is a very good thing. And could we please get a round of applause for Gilad and all of his insights? Thank you so much for joining us.
And many thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
And you survived load shedding.
I survived load shedding.
And I also, just want to take this opportunity to remind everyone that Likud is happening Friday, Saturday, Sunday, very exciting. And Gilad is making
three
sessions.
So you spoiled for choice. And yeah, we also hope to see everyone there and engaging more. Thank you all so much.
And for braving the weather.
Yes.
A round of applause to yourself.
Thank you to everyone online.
Yes. Yeah, no, braving the weather and load shedding is definitely
Can everyone
obstacles.
grab snacks on the way out? And hang around and engage more. If you feel
It wouldn't be a Jewish-orientated event if there wasn't food at the center.
Of course. What about drinks?